Hello, everyone. I'm Joanna Williams, Associate Professor in School Psychology at Rutgers University and proud co-editor of this amazing book titled Conceptualizations of Blackness in Educational Research. I'm joined today by the incredible authors who contributed their pieces to our section on Black Futurities. Dr. Shamari Reed is Assistant Professor of Justice and Belonging in Development and Education at New York University. Dr. Autumn Griffin is McDonnell Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education in the Reading, Writing, and Literacies Department. Dr. Jennifer D. Turner is Associate Professor in Reading Education and Director of the Masters in Reading Program at the University of Maryland, College Park. And Blake O'Neill Turner is Doctoral Candidate in Urban Education in the Department of Teaching and Learning, Policy and Leadership at the University of Maryland. You'll get to hear from each of them shortly. First, let me tell you about the book, Conceptualizations of Blackness in Educational Research. Our contributors narrate how they've come to compelling theories of Blackness and how these theories inform the research they do with young people. Collectively, we tell a multidisciplinary story about the careful reading and analyses of scholars committed to a critical Black studies that refuses reductive notions of Blackness. As I mentioned, our section of the book is called Black Futurities, and each chapter, through a distinct focus on possibility with and for youth, speaks to the idea of uplifting Black futures. Envisioning futures requires wrestling with, letting go of, refusing, escaping, and understanding pasts. The contributors narrate stories of how their thinking about Blackness has changed, refusing ways of measuring and assessing Blackness that are overdetermined by whiteness. They share how nearly murdered spirits were resuscitated with the breath of other voices. It was Toni Morrison who intervened in Dr. Reed's miseducation about Blackness and reoriented him to an understanding that connected back to the teachings of his original maternal scholars. Excuse me. He relearned Black scholarship should not be concerned with explaining oppression to our oppressors. We can find our worth in our ways of being and doing. Toni Morrison reminded Dr. Reed that we are our best thing. Doctors Autumn Griffin and Jennifer Turner center Black feminist and Black girlhood theories, quote, to theorize the future dreams of Black adolescent girls, holding space for their hopes and dreams, end quote. They recognize the importance of reflection and time travel. Looking back, being present, and looking ahead are all essential for imagining future possibilities. Griffin and Turner understand that no one theory is complete. Collage and mosaic are necessary. They invite us to sit with them at the kitchen table where they breathe life into their discursive analysis of Black girls' multimodal future making, offering all of us another way of seeing the world in the future. Finally, Blake Turner knew schools to be a place of harm for Black youth, but believed she was protected in her storm cellar, where her father insisted that excelling in school would be the antidote to anti-Black racism. Her worth and humanity would shine if she just worked hard enough. Turner began pushing out of her protective storm cellar with the help of critical mathematics education scholars, who allowed her, quote, to see the possibilities of an otherwise world free from anti-Blackness. In these fantastical landscapes, there are no storm cellars because anti-Blackness and white supremacy have been eradicated, end quote. Centering Black futurity and theorizing about race and racialization means shifting away from a focus on oppression to a focus on humanity. It is about acknowledging our gifts, our joy, our everyday ways of living. It is about being in conversation with Black people, not about them. And now I invite all of you to hear more from our contributors about their visions for Black futurity. We'll begin with Dr. Shamari Reed, whose chapter is called The Beautiful, Beautiful River, Toni Morrison and Theorizing Blackness Outside the White Gaze. Dr. Reed.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm so excited to read from my chapter, which we now know is titled The Beautiful, Beautiful River, Toni Morrison and Theorizing Blackness Outside the White Gaze. Just a bit about my chapter. This chapter came out in 3 separate letters addressed to the Black community, but specifically thinking about other Black researchers and what I wanted to say with us and to us as we think about engaging in scholarship, which works toward our collective liberation and reducing the inequality in the lives of young Black people. And so I'm going to read letter 2. Letter 2. Dear Black people, I apologize for trying to disappear us into the cacophony of racism. I attempted to erase us. I looked at us and saw only what white people had done. I invisibilized our humanity and our gifts. Before I met Toni Morrison, I conflated Blackness and Black people with racism. I misunderstood Black studies as the study of the chaos whiteness introduced into our realities. I held on tightly to the idea that our existence was defined by our encounters with whiteness and the people it birthed. Clinging to such an arthritic lie nearly paralyzed me. I used my body less. I ignored my imagination and creativity. Drunk on the illusion that our lives only mattered if whiteness agreed, I believed our expressions of love did not warrant my scholarly attention. I believed that us laughing was no more than just a warming up of our voices to say something greater, more important, something about racism, about whiteness, about white people. Thankfully, Toni Morrison happened. A few years ago, I devoured her novel, Beloved, then The Bluest Eye, followed by Song of Solomon, Sula, Source of Self-Regard, Jazz, Paradise, and so many others. Toni helped me see that I was lost in the jungle white people planted in us, using myself up to serve them and their unlearning. I foolishly believed that Black scholarship should be dedicated to explaining our torture to our torturers. I thought that if we only had the right Black theories, they would believe our lives mattered. But through Toni, I relearned that we are worthy of my intellectual gifts, time, energy, my love, and my life. We are our best thing. Because of Toni, I arrived at the sobering realization that not only is it possible to exist outside the white gaze, it's beautiful here, and quiet as it's kept. Here is where marigolds blossom and love abounds. Here at the edge, we are accompanied by water and its perfect memory. Shall we gather at the river with Toni, the beautiful, beautiful river? At the river where we hold true to the notion that our lives matter, releasing ourselves from the prison of trying to prove our humanity to others. At the river where we don't preoccupy ourselves with telling stories only of how white people so brilliantly do violence and destruction. At the river where we are At the river where we engage with young Black people in collective explorations of our love, joy, agency, healing, genius, and creativity, because those things too are us. And I, of course, believe it is worthwhile to work toward dismantling, and in no way mean to discredit the wonderful work that has been done with regard to racial justice and research. However, I would like to extend our scholarly endeavors to also explore how we so beautifully do life at the river. In thinking about research and the lives of young Black people and the inequality they face, I think exploring the areas of Black life I mentioned before might be a way forward or backward, back to us. If we are serious in our desire to bring about a world more free, then we must seriously engage with models of such a world in which Black people thrive. And the closest examples we have are in the spaces that Black people have created for ourselves. And knowledge about why these spaces were created is extremely important, but we also stand to learn from how they were and are created and what sustains them. What can be known about our lives when we remove the white gaze and decenter our confrontation with white people to focus on our doing? What can be learned from the way we practice joy, from the way we love, from the way we care for one another? And if our audience becomes Black people, as Toni Morrison encouraged, Black youth specifically, what might we hope they learn from our words? How might knowing who we are and what we have done for and with each other offer them inspiration? We are more than what has been done to us by our oppressors. In fact, that isn't even us. That has more to do with them than us. As I think about the possibilities of futurity for Black people and Black research, I encourage us to return to the beautiful, beautiful river. The one that Toni mentions cuts us off from the most magnificent hatred we have ever known. the one where we are accompanied by water in its perfect memory, the one where we remember all the things we have been taught to forget. As we acknowledge the work of dismantling and destroying institutions of whiteness, we must always be simultaneously freedom dreaming up something new. And in order to do that, to dream, we must return to the river because we are the water. And all water has a perfect memory and is forever trying to get back to where it once was. If only our memory could be so perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was really lovely to hear that in your words, having read it so many times on the page. And I think it ties in nicely if we think about, possibilities and dreaming our futures to our next chapter. So I'm just as excited to hear from our next co-authors, Dr. Autumn Griffin and Dr. Jennifer D. Turner, about their chapter, which is titled Imagining Possible Black Girl Futures, Critical Self-Reflection as Praxis for Theorizing with Black Girls.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you for having us here today. We are excited to share our work. So our chapter brings together images from two Black girls' visual artwork, images and vision boards, as well as our own images as two literacy scholars and Black women. And we theorize the dreams of Black girls through Black feminist and arts-based qualitative methods, including collage and mosaic. Throughout the chapter, we illustrate through stories and images how dreams become spaces where Black girls can create, play, explore, heal, and live. And today we'll read a few excerpts from that chapter. Who we be together. Together we be Black women creatives, life force personified, love personified, spirit manifested, unbound by the restrictions and constraints of the academy, sometimes too big, too complex, too human for words and theories, too enveloped by feeling, by intuition, by livingness, to name the unnameable, unafraid of the unknown and not knowing. We be the realized dreams of our ancestors, the undarkened futures of this country. We be the hope of the future. We be Black girls, and we be here.
Black Girl Futurity, Mosaics of Black Girls' Futures. In our chapter, we engage in discursive analysis, reflecting on our work with Black girls over the years, as well as our own histories and dreams of the future. Importantly, we note one central aspect of our work together, our ability to disrupt traditional structures of power within the academy, moving from an advisor-student relationship to one that centers a Black feminist ethic of care for one another as humans first, and as scholars second. Given this fact, we find a kitchen table talk to be most suitable as it provides a space for us to be our most authentic selves, as we discuss work that, at its core, is rooted in similar practices of love, care, and vulnerability. We use this section to build a bridge between our theoretical orientations and the methods we take up. We draw on the methodological work of Venus Evans Winters and Lalitha Vasudevan, who not only encourage us to engage in humanizing and arts-based forms of research, but also to see the humanity of the communities with whom we work and engage in research as an act of love and collaborative knowledge building. We take up the notions of collage and mosaic as analytic frames as we engage in a kitchen table talk to discuss our work and the futures Black girls collectively imagine for themselves, as evidenced by their multimodal renderings. We invite you to our kitchen table to theorize alongside us in real time.
What we see, Black girls' multimodal renderings as visionary. We've created this dream board of images from the work we've done with Black girls and some of our own photographic images. I'm wondering what are some of the themes we see throughout the board in terms of color, shape, pattern, or any other artistic features.
I noticed right away how much blue there was in just so many different shades. And it reminded me immediately of how Black girl futures are connected to possibility and the expansiveness of the horizon. And that opened up ideas for me in terms of blue. But then I also thought about blue water, like in the piece you wrote and the connection to Africa, Autumn, that you've written, and to our legacies in terms of enslavement in the United States, and the complicated relationship that so many Black girls and women have with water. In seeing all these gorgeous shades of blue across the mosaic, I was thinking about both of those things opening up futures, futures that are connected to legacies, legacies that are sometimes traumatic and yet also hold joy and hope for Black girls.
When you mentioned the horizon, I immediately thought of their eyes were watching God. And one of my favorite quotes is at the end when Janie's coming home to her grandmother's house. The text says, "Here was peace. She pulled in her horizon like a great fishnet, pulled it in from around the waist of the world and draped it over her shoulders. So much of life in its meshes. She called in her soul to come and see." There is something about the horizon, something about this blue that represents peace and hope, represents outdoor space. In her own discussions of Black girlhood, Tamara Butler says she sees a lot of green spaces in the future for Black girls, outdoor spaces. We're in an age of reclaiming our connection to these outdoor spaces. And we see that with this blue and this water represented in the collage. I've been reading about healing lately, specifically for Black folks. And if you think about our relationship to water historically as Black Americans, it's not a coincidence we see all of this blue, all of this sky and water represented on these boards.
I agree. And Their Eyes Were Watching God was such a powerful book for me as well. As a Black girl in college, I was struggling to define myself on my own terms, especially in my romantic relationships with Black men. And I love Janie because she was working to define herself and her life as a Black woman. And that speaks to the images on our mosaic. It's crucial that Black girls are defining their futures in terms of life spaces, work, and relationships for themselves. That self-definition is essential for Black girls and women because we know that there are so many other forces trying to define us and limit our futures. These images represent how Black girls have the freedom and the authority to assert who they want to be in the world and the futures they want to see for themselves. There's an important sense of Black girl gaze here in these images, that as Black girls and women, we have the right to define who we are in all our complexities and to claim the futures we want to see. And these images here are part of the ways that we make that manifest.
That is beautiful. I had my students read Their Eyes Were Watching God a few semesters ago, and one of them said their eyes were watching God, as in their eyes were watching the horizon, capital H, equating the horizon to the divine. And when you talk about the gaze, there's a repositioning of the Black girl gaze towards this horizon that is represented on this page. It makes me think of Ntozake Shange's quote where she says, "I found God in myself and I loved her fiercely." And we see images of that here too, in the image of this Black woman in her yellow top on the water. You can see the horizon and she's soaking up the sun and she's full of joy. There's another image of a Black woman off to the right with her family, and she's totally enraptured by them. Even the picture on the top left of the woman with locks. And it's even evident in your picture with your family, and the joy on everyone's face. So there are themes of horizon and gaze, and also these themes of joy coming through as well. And to some extent, nourishment, and not necessarily in the form of food, but in the form of green life, in the form of nature, in the form of being outside with water and with community, nourishment in the form of the divine.
I love what you just said about nourishing our desires and passions as Black women. I remember there was a time in my life where I didn't even use words like desire or passion because I was afraid to say what brought me joy as a Black woman. And so I'm just always smiling when I see the girls we work with and ourselves putting forward what we desire and what we're passionate about. I love that your photograph on the mosaic towards the top right affirms your passion for reading. I couldn't find a photograph of myself reading at that age, but reading is a passion that we share, which is how we came to read Jacqueline Woodson's Brown Girl Dreaming, the image in the middle of our mosaic. The idea that Black girls need the space to freely name their passions and consider how their desires show up and inform their futures is essential. For example, in the mosaic, the girl's passion for travel was depicted by the globe and by the woman soaking up the sun. Our girls also shared their passions related to what they wanted to look like in college, illustrated by the images of the shoes and the bag and the young woman with the sunglasses. For me, those images don't simply represent material things, but the way these girls asserted authority over their own bodies and futures. I love that they're bringing forward their desires, asserting and affirming the ways they want their bodies to look in college and in the various spaces they envision entering in that space, whether they're classrooms, parties, or workplaces, along with the futures that they want to see. That's so powerful because so many girls, Black girls' desires are silenced. Black girls are constantly told that they shouldn't desire, that they don't deserve to get what they want because they're not worthy. They are not white girls, nor are they Black men. And so to use the word desire is so important when we theorize Black girls' futures, especially in relation to their bodies.
And to conclude our reading today, we'll jump to the end where we ask ourselves, what theories of Black girlhood do we want to see proliferate in the world? As we answer this question, we engage in our own acts of future gazing, turning to our ancestors, as well as inward, upward, and backward to determine what we want for Black girls everywhere, including the Black girls within ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for sharing that and sharing the visual that inspired your work. And again, for inviting us to have a seat at that kitchen table with you. I think we see a real thread that connects your work to Blake's work, because she really talks about her journey of kind of defining her own possibility and defining her own self as a scholar. So let's hear now from Blake O'Neill Turner about her chapter, which is called Faulty Foundations, Research and Reckoning with Anti-Blackness in Mathematics Education.
Thank you, Dr. Williams and the other editors of the book, as well as the William T. Grant Foundation for creating this space. So as Dr. Williams just stated, I begin my chapter by speaking about the ways that education, the false neutrality in mathematics education, and the belief in meritocracy felt like a storm cellar that in some ways felt like a fugitive space, but lacked the transformational change really demanded of true fugitive spaces. But like a fugitive space, my safety in my storm cellar was liminal, especially in an anti-Black world. And so I read from the section of my chapter where I began to seek to push back against the academy and find scholarship that radically imagined a Black liberatory mathematics education, setting me on a journey towards finding refuge in Black critical theory. And so I began. While I was struggling to reconcile my feelings about the broad educational research I was being introduced to in my program, I was also immersing myself in mathematics education literature, hoping to expose racism in what has historically been considered a race-neutral field in order to create a new blueprint, a blueprint that would create better opportunities in mathematics for Black students. I soon realized that I was encountering the same narratives in scholarship that had been used to murder my spirit as a little girl. I was expected to engage in conversation about what constituted good research using white logic and white methods as my onto-epistemological frame. Zuberi and Bonasabia define white logic as a historical posture that grants eternal objectivity to the views of white elites and condemns the views of non-whites to perpetual subjectivity. White methods are the practical tools used to manufacture empirical data and analysis to support the racial stratification in society. Having to demonstrate that I had considered the varied perspectives and interpretations, especially those entrenched in anti-Blackness and white supremacy, was a form of epistemological violence that forced me to use the very tools that were causing me harm to continue to perpetuate these cycles of violence. These deficit discourses have tasted bitter, like someone serving me poison and then expecting me to tell them how good it is. I was expected to critique and find strengths in the work of scholars who positioned me and other Black folks as inferior while constructing us as the other. I was expected to read, cite, and expound upon the work of scholars committed to anti-Blackness and white supremacy. The messages that I received were codified and communicated. Black kids aren't good enough to be math people. Black kids don't do math, and Black kids won't do well in math. I began to realize, as Audre Lorde writes, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. I had learned that despite my hopes, current forms of research could not be a tool to expose, critique, and dismantle anti-Blackness. Thus, I needed something to shift, and thankfully something did. Several critical shifts occurred early in my pursuit to be a producer of educational research in mathematics education. These events were not only the catalyst to me being and becoming a Black critical mathematics educator, but they were also foundational to shaping who I am as a scholar, educator, and disruptor. The first shift occurred after I began to deliberately seek research from critical mathematics education researchers, as Martin states, who believe in the humanity of Black people and actively resist and reject mathematics education research that results in epistemological violence and mathematics reforms that perpetuate anti-Blackness. My onto-epistemological understanding of mathematics education research had already begun to crack, so I sought scholarship that could begin to help me make sense of my discomfort. The current mathematics education enterprise, as well as the myth that mathematics is neutral, objective, and culture-free, has created a narrow view of mathematics. The first time that I read that mathematics and mathematics education is not racially and politically neutral or culturally free, I felt the water leaking into my storm cellar. Now my beliefs were tangible. A race-neutral or colorblind approach to mathematics education research was not possible because, as Danny Martin states, mathematics education as a research enterprise is not immune to the structural and institutional racism that characterizes many other areas of society. This structural and institutional racism exists above and beyond the good intentions of individual white scholars. Reading the work of critical mathematics educators like Danny Martin, Jemima Young, Macy Golson, Louis Leyva, Ebony McGee, Rochelle Gutierrez, and Erica Bullock has been foundational to my understanding of how mathematics education research could begin to disrupt false notions of impartiality in methods and challenge the dominant discourses produced about Black learners of mathematics. The work of a small but powerful cadre of critical scholars in mathematics education served as a telescope for me to see beyond the violence and oppression that's produced and reproduced in mathematics education, praxis, policy, and research. And as Stephanie Tolliver states, and see that those liberatory, futuristic, and fantastical landscapes are actually closer than they first appeared to be. Through this telescope, I have been able to see the possibilities of an otherwise world free from anti-Blackness. In these fantastical landscapes, there are no storm cellars because anti-Blackness and white supremacy have been eradicated. The world I saw through the telescope of critical race scholarship stood in stark contrast to the current conditions of the world and my storm cellar. As I read critical texts about race, racism, mathematics, and ideas about the possibilities and impossibilities of reform and liberation, I've had to engage in critical reflective inquiry. Who am I aligning myself to? In what ways am I complicit in this system? In what ways am I destructive to the current system? And how is holding on to my storm cellar preventing me from dreaming of and reaching otherwise worlds? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Blake. And thanks to all of you for sharing in your own voice excerpts from your chapters. I think it's really, again, very powerful to hear how it sounds because what you share is really deeply connected to who you are. So it's very personal. And I appreciate you writing the chapters and also taking time to read them for us. So now we've got some time just to chat with one another and, share a little bit more about the work that we've contributed to the book, excuse me, as well as, who we are as scholars. So I want to create space first for folks to just talk a little bit more about the title of our book section, which is Black Futurities. So what does the idea sort of mean to you in your work? And how does it inform the research that you do with and for young people? And anybody who's ready is welcome to jump in.
Well, I guess I can start. For me, in just thinking of the chapters and the themes that were coming forward for me was this idea of freedom dreaming and the ability to dream without limitation, without oppression, and especially for Black kids. And I think that's where Autumn and I were really coming from with Black girls in particular, that so many times they don't have spaces in their lives where they might be able to dream freely. And especially in schools, I would say that those spaces are not liberatory, as we just heard Blake talk about so eloquently in math, for example, and the same kinds of things happen in literacy, where Black youth and Black girls in particular are told they're not literate enough, they're not smart enough to do literacy. And so for me, it's really about moving beyond that and really allowing and inviting Black girls to have that space to just be themselves and who they are, and to see what they want to see, to talk about the music that moves them and inspires them, and to really have that freedom to just imagine in ways that feel good to them, and just inspire them in terms of who they are, what they want to see, and not only for their own future, but for the world as well. So I think that's one of the things Autumn and I have tried to do with the arts especially. And I'm thinking of Bettina Love talking about arts as freedom dreaming. And so again, that invitation for Black girls to take up visual arts for us, for me at least, was really important. And I think in our work together, Autumn and I have really tried to create these different invitational spaces for Black girls in particular to freedom dream.
I think especially as I was doing my chapter or writing my chapter, one of the things that I was really thinking about is like, it's a scary space to be in a space where you're freedom dreaming, because there aren't a lot of models of like the possibilities. Meaning like, I just don't have that limitation because that's not how I was socialized. It was not how I was taught. It was not how I was trained as a student, as a mathematician, as a researcher. But I think there's a lot of hope in that as well. And so I'm trying to stay in that space of like, yes, it is very scary, but there's now so much more possibility now that I'm using critical race theory in my research of what could be. And so how do we begin to dismantle this world and dream of something different and get to somewhere new?
I think for me, when I think about sort of Black futurity and reducing inequalities in the section that we are all a part of, I just know that we were there. I know that we're in the future already. And I know because I know. And so really this chapter for me was sort of releasing, letting go, and letting all the people who have spoken to me speak through me, specifically Toni Morrison, and really thinking through like, what have I learned? What have we learned? If I really just think about us and the fact that we are here. And so when I think about futurity, I'm like, I'm sure 400 plus years ago, maybe folks didn't see this, but we're here. And so we know how to cast ourselves into the future amidst depression. We've always done that. And so for me, it was just a question of, okay, how have we always done that? And what can we learn from us? Which I use this motif of the river and Toni Morrison to think through, how do we get back to us, just like water does and always does. How do we get back to ourselves? Because we are actually the answer, because we've always freedom dreamt and we've always sort of envisioned possible futures and life worlds, despite all of the sort of chaos that has been introduced into our realities. And so for me, I love this question, but it wasn't a question for me. It was really thinking through, I know we're in the future. How do I know that? Why do I know that? And how do we get there? But I know we're there already.
Shamari, I love that you said, I know, and then you ended the sentence with, because I know. And I think when I think about futurity, it is a returning to our ancestral practices, right? Like Black ancestral practices of like being in touch with our intuition and of calling out to our ancestors and engaging spirit, right? And so I think when I think about futurity, it is so many of the things that Black schools, or not Black schools, that schools attempt to stomp out of Black children, right? And so we are already there, and the future is much more beautiful than our present, right? Because there is this returning and this reclamation of who we were and who we always are and always will be.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear it phrased that way from each of you, but Shamari, from you in particular, because in your chapters, I would say your chapter and Blake's chapter in particular, you sort of narrate that there was still a journey and that we know. But Autumn, you just said like schools try to stamp that knowing out of us. And so there's still kind of some relearning that has to happen along the way. When you think about these chapters, I think about them as sort of a gift in the world. And who do you hope will read your chapters? So these are chapters in a book on, critical Black studies in education. I think they speak to issues that go beyond that, but I'm curious to hear from each of you. Who do you hope, who would you give this to as a gift? Our section of our collection of chapters, and why?
Go ahead.
No, you got it. Go ahead, Blake.
Yeah. And I think it's because of the stage that I'm at where I'm finishing up my dissertation, but I wish that I would have had these chapters when I started my program. And I think that I would have been more bold to begin with. It took me a little bit of time to get on the journey that I'm on now out of fear. And I wish I would have had other scholars to be in these conversations with from the get-go and know that there's so many more possibilities than what I thought.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my answers as well, is that I wish that I had this and I would give this to younger doc students. I think I was really fortunate to have an advisor who Jen allowed me to explore and be creative and kind of just play with theory. But I think for so many, there's a stifling feeling. I also think I would give this to my grandmother. My work, I always believe that if my grandmother cannot pick up something that I wrote and understand it, then I haven't done my job, right? And not only that, if I think about futurity as also returning to our practices of old, who better to read it than someone who is an elder and the matriarch in my family, but also very much connected to ancestors that I never met. And so I would give it to my grandmother.
I think I would give the chapters to Black adolescents, so Black teen girls, Black boys, just to give them, not even to give them anything, but to open up again spaces and invite, connections that they might see through some of the images or some of the music or some of the passions that our girls spoke so eloquently about. To invite them to look at the world a lot differently and to see what they would want to see. What could teachers do differently for them? Those kinds of supports I think are really important. I probably would give it to teachers as well. But for me, it would be, does this speak to Black youth? Does it speak to the young people? And how does it do that? How can we learn from them what they need to see in their futures and what they want to see? And I think for me, that's really important. If my boys, I have 2 college age boys, if they could read this and resonate with it in some way, shape, or form, whether it's the Drake song that one of the girls put on there or some other kind of image, even looking at some of our the family photo there, I would want it to speak to them in such a way that they felt freedom to then speak back to that and to move forward with their own sense of futurity.
I think my simple, grounded answer, I have some complicated answers. My simple, grounded answer is Black people. That's why I address them. I title each letter Black people. Any Black person who finds themselves with this, it's for them. It really is to have a conversation with us, about how we get to where we know we deserve to be. The more complicated, layered answers, myself, at all stages of my life. And so when I return, I hope that I have this as a young person, as when I'm in school, when I'm on the streets. And so I really did write the thing that I wanted to read. And even though it's in draft form and the book isn't even out yet, I read this chapter a lot on my own because it re-inspires me. And it just reminds me of what I'm doing here on Earth. And then the last answer, and probably the most layered and complex answer, is for Toni. I want Toni to read this. This is for Toni. And it's a thank you letter to her for allowing her life and her words to sort of spread over the consciousness of our world.
Thank you. I want to talk a little bit about, we are in academia. So that is a particular place and space. And as you may remember, when we put out the call for contributions, we asked you a few questions. One of those was, what do you wish to see more scholars in your field achieve? And another was, if you could make a change to your field, what would that change be? So thinking about your chapter, our section, this volume, what are your current answers to these questions? What do you hope to see more scholars in your field achieve? What kind of changes do you think are necessary for those changes to happen?
I think I say this rather explicitly in letter 3, kind of what I'm doing here and what I hope to do and what I would like to see in the field among other scholars. And it's twofold. The first thing is I really want us to be more genuine and deliberate about how we can think intersectionally about all of the things that we're experiencing. I do think we get into trouble with single identity initiatives. I do. I think if we continue to think that Black people are only Black, cisgender, heterosexual men, we're not going to get anywhere. And I know that we say that over and over and over again. And you have Black women who have said that for a very long time and have done scholarship, and we all cite them and we use intersectionality all over the place, but yet I just don't see it happening. I don't see us as a people, as a field, thinking collectively. It seems very siloed. And so I try to get at that. We have to think about race in sort of tandem with every other part of our identity, because if we don't do that, we're leaving out Black people, thus we're not doing anything for Black people. So that's the first thing that I think we have to see more of. I think it's a requirement, is to really think collectively about how we get to wherever it is we think we deserve to be. And then the other piece is really exploring our own agency. I think it's quite dangerous to talk about us as if we have not loved ourselves into this future. And I think that it's really easy sometimes to just think about the struggle. And while that's real, we're still here. And so I would hope that more folks in our field are thinking about what does it look like to explore and to literally do research, as I talk about at the river. And I mean that metaphorically, but also quite literally. What does it look like to study and explore how your mother loved you and how that love might be the reason that we are still here, for example? And so I push us toward an emphasis on joy and love and agency, but from a standpoint that takes into account our intersecting identities.
Being in spaces like this always reminds me why I stay in the academy. And I think if there was something I were to change in the field, it would be to cultivate more spaces like this, more spaces where we can be and where we can talk about these theories. Just hearing Shamari talk about love and joy, and that is that's the direction my work is heading in as well, right? I don't read that often. I don't get to see full human portraits of Black folks, right? And so to be able to engage in these spaces, but also read more work that is not talking about our deficits or just always struggles and challenges, right? But to read more work that is rooted in joy. I'm so thankful for folks like Goldie who are coming out with work on joy and like what it means to be joyful Black folks who exist in schools. And so if I were to change anything, it would absolutely be that.
I've been trying to think of an easy thing to say about mathematics and mathematics education, where we should start, but I think it has to start with the base point has to be Black humanity. And I don't think that mathematics does that. And mathematics education doesn't do that. And I think we also have to acknowledge as a field, we've done harm and we continue to do harm and we continue to hide behind neutrality and whiteness. And so even thinking about what you were saying, Shamari, like we don't often, when we talk about our positionality as researchers, especially in math ed, it's like listing off, like I'm this, and this, and now here's but where there's no true criticality of like, so how did that impact the questions you asked and what did you research and how did you go about it? And so there's a lot of things that math ed has to change, but I think if we start with the baseline of Black humanity, there will have to be major differences in the field.
Yeah, I agree with what you've all said, that Black humanity is the basis, and just even in the sense, I'm thinking of Maisha Wynn's work around worthy witnessing. And so for me, that's coming up in some of the themes of what I've heard you all say, mostly because in my work with Black girls in particular, I have had those moments where I didn't maybe agree or even know what they really were talking about. And yet I wanted to jump in and say, well, but wait a minute, let me tell you. And it's not that way. If you're talking about freedom dreaming and you're talking about the humanity and celebrating what Black girls bring and the futures that they see, then it's that celebration that needs to move forward in the ways that you witness what they're doing. And so for me, it's putting some of my own judgments aside, putting aside my adult hat that wants to say, I know better because I've lived longer. Yes, I have some experiences, but I think to honor and celebrate the futures that Black kids and again, in particular, Black girls see for themselves is that idea of, am I respectful? Am I honoring what is being said? And I think that's so very important. And for me, it's bringing that forward beyond the traditional qualitative research where you're interviewing or giving those spaces, doing observations. It really is working with girls and alongside them, not doing research on them. And I think that's really part of what I heard you all saying in terms of affirming Black humanity.
So one of the connective threads that I keep coming back to as I continue to read and reread your chapters that sort of knits them together is that future dreaming in academia really requires drawing wisdom from many. So all of you collectively name literary writers, you name historians, essayists, scholars, past and present. So you've mentioned and quoted Zora Neale Hurston, Bell Hooks, Toni Morrison. And in your pieces, they feel as essential as the spaces and knowledge created by, folks who we might consider traditional academic scholars. So I wonder if anybody wants to comment on how you sort of navigate that and why that's so important to you in your work.
In letter one, I sort of speak about, as a doc student, how violent I realized it was that I was always evaluated on how well I could approximate the thoughts and ideas of white people and white theorists and white philosophers. And I didn't know really how to articulate that violence. I know it felt strange. I know it felt like an erasure of sorts, but I just thought that was the game, and so I did it. I later would discover Gloria Lassing-Billings, who wrote a wonderful, wonderful book chapter on, I think it's racialized epistemologies or something of the sort. And she gave me language to really understand why I think it's important that we expand the canon, but also dismantle it, also think differently about who can be a theorist and who can be a philosopher. And what she said was this: she's not discounting the contributions of white philosophers and theorists. What she said was, they know what they know, and that's just not the whole world. And so I think that if we continue to center only one group of thinkers, they know some things, they thought about some things. I'm not saying that's not valid, but it's grounded in one experience. And if we're serious about understanding the complexity of our humanity and we want to get anywhere, it will take all of us and our collective wisdom and our collective knowledge to really think through how we move forward. And so I'm so grateful to her for that language, because I couldn't articulate what I was trying to say, and people would always sort of mistake my words to say like, oh, you're saying they have no contributions. I'm like, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is there are limitations to their lives and limitations to their knowledge and limitations to how it may be applied to people like me, for example, because they are grounded in an experience that's not mine, and in many ways is antagonistic to mine. And so then we have to augment, if you will, that knowledge base with the Tonys and the Zoras and the Kimberleys and so many other wonderful thinkers, because they know what they know. It's a particular experience, and it'll take all of us. And so I think with what I'm hearing here, all of us talk about, is that seems to be really important for our own growth. I needed for example, Gloria Lasting-Billings so that I could unlearn and understand what I was going through. And then I needed Tony, and then I needed James, then I needed Belle. I actually needed that. And if I had just focused on the theories that were given to me in grad school, I wouldn't have healed and I wouldn't have unlearned. And I don't know that I'd be able to even freedom dream. And so it just really, for in my own life, I can see the necessity of rounding out the knowledge base for myself as a person who needed to heal from all the things I had experienced as a Black person, as a Black queer person, with a single mother, right? I needed to heal from that. And unfortunately, the theories that I was given in grad school were not able to help me heal. And so I think we have to just acknowledge the limitations. That's all. Not saying they're all wrong, it's all bad, but all of us are limited, which means it'll take all of us to understand the complete picture of what we're experiencing and a complete vision of the future that we deserve.
One of the comments that I often get when I write pieces that I'm very quote heavy. And I think part of that is because often for Black scholars, we're not given credit for the work that we do. It's taken, it's codified, it's made somebody else's. And so I'm very intentional about making sure that I'm uplifting the voices that have been so central to my journey, where I'm at and where I'm going. And to not, the words that they wrote, they took time and care and effort to write them. And I don't want to just summarize. And so I'm quote heavy because I want to make sure that I'm articulating exactly what they said, because what they wrote was powerful and it needed to be included instead of just the citation. I need you to know what line exactly was what led me here.
Yeah, I was sitting here debating whether or not to share this, but I had a professor in undergrad. He was my favorite. His name was Keith Gilliard. And he would start every class that we took by citing, and I don't remember who this quote was, but it was a former president said that the Negro is incapable of art. Every time we took his class, that's what he would start with, right? And I took classes with him on like Black poetry, Black playwrights, Black essay, right? And so at the time I was like, why do we don't need to keep hearing this, right? But throughout the years, it's encouraged me to think of all of the times I encountered educators who, if they didn't say this with their words, they said it with their actions, with their choices, with what was on their syllabus or in their curricula or what was not there, right? And I often think about how many Black students experience that same thing. And so for me, it took this unlearning and relearning and creating my own syllabi, right? Even if not on paper, and directing my own learning and reading and rereading to support my growth. And I very much identify with what Blake is saying, is that it's me leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, right? For folks that read behind me to understand that this is a lineage, that we've been doing this. This is not new. And to say that even if these are not things you've been introduced to, they exist. And here's where you can find them. And so I think of it as almost like a quilt, right? Like if I think about enslavement and the Underground Railroad and the way that quilts served as like this signal for what was safe and where to go, I think the quotes that I leave and the people that I cite in my work are very much that same practice of like, here, if you're looking, here's where you can find more.
I was just sitting here trying to take all this in. I think for me, I'm thinking of Cynthia Dillard's work and the idea that Black women in particular have to bring together the intellectual and then with the spiritual, and to really experience the fullness of Black womanhood. And part of that holistic view, and she says them way more eloquently than I can, is again, it's very much limited in academia. It's always the space of what do you know, but not what is the purpose you feel, or what is the passion that is part of that. And so the intellectual in the academy is always there. And I've written so much like that, especially through my tenure experiences. I thought that was the only way to go. And so I was really taken, again, with thinking about art and visual art in particular around Tina Camp's work on creative refusal, and how I see now my work is much more of refusing to just talk about and acknowledge the intellectual work that I've done, but it's also this creative spirit. Where is that coming in? How can I make sure that that is honored and celebrated? And how can I make sure that the Academy makes more room for other scholars to embrace that about themselves and to have more holistic visions of their futures in the Academy and beyond? And so for me, that those ideas are going together in terms of creative refusal, and then really thinking much more carefully about bringing together the intellectual and the spiritual, and remembering who we are, why we're doing what we do. It's not for some kind of outcome from the Academy, although that might be great. It's much more than that. It's speaking to our people. And I feel like that's, especially our kids, our babies, I feel like that is so important to let them know that they can also come whole into a classroom, into the workplace, into their futures.
To me, I think that really says so much what each of you just shared, and Jennifer really ending with a focus on thinking about young people who are central to all of the work that we do, and who are really central to thinking about, future dreaming. So I want to sincerely thank each of you for your chapters, for taking the time to reflect and expand upon them in our discussion today. As I said earlier, I see them as a gift, and it's a gift that for me, I really think can be offered to so many people in our lives. I think in particular about young people and what it would mean for them to, have these chapters as they are growing and thinking and dreaming their own futures. I want to take a moment to acknowledge Drs. Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang for their vision that made this book possible. I also want to thank the William T. Grant Foundation for their ongoing support of the project and for all of the contributors. And last, I want to thank the team at the University of Toronto who made our webinar today possible. Last, I'll end by thanking again each of you, our wonderful authors. I really have been inspired by all of the work that you've done, and thank you so much for your contributions.